The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but David barely noticed. He stood by the kitchen window, watching the sky turn an ugly shade of gray over the bay. The clouds were rolling in fast, the kind that reminded him of that night 11 years ago. The night that changed everything, 11 years. It felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Hurricane Delilah had torn through their small coastal town like an angry beast. The wind had been so loud that night, people said it sounded like a freight train that never stopped. When the sun finally came up 2 days later, Harborview looked like a war zone. Houses flattened, cars tossed around like toys, and 17 people gone forever. His little sister Rachel was one of them. David squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the memory of identifying her body at the temporary morgue they'd set up in the high school gymnasium. She'd been just 23, fresh out of college.
Full of plans to change the world?
That night she'd been volunteering at the community center, helping elderly residents evacuate to higher ground. They found her in the rubble 3 days after the storm passed. For 11 years, David had carried that weight. The guilt of being the older brother who survived while she didn't. The anger at a storm that took her away. The hollow ache that never quite went away, no matter how many years passed. He'd built a life around that hole in his heart. Became a high school teacher. Kept his head down. Avoided the memorial services every year, because hearing other people talk about their grief only made his worse. His wife Karen tried to understand, but how could she? She hadn't lost anyone that night. The envelope had arrived that morning. No return address, just his name written in careful block letters. Inside was a single photograph. David had stared at it for 20 minutes straight, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was Rachel's car, that old blue Honda she'd been so proud of. In the photo, it was parked outside the community center. Covered in rain, the emergency lights from police cars reflecting off its hood. But it was the timestamp in the corner that made his blood run cold. 47 p.m. According to every official report, every news story, every memorial speech for the past 11 years, the community center had collapsed at 9:30 p.m. David had memorized those details. Read the official investigation report until he could recite it in his sleep. The building had failed during the height of the storm. Tragic but unavoidable. A terrible accident in the chaos of a natural disaster. So why was Rachel's car still there more than 2 hours later? His hands were shaking as he picked up the photograph again. He looked for signs that it had been doctored, manipulated somehow. But the metadata on the back confirmed it. The date, the time, the location coordinates. Someone had been there. Someone had taken this photo at 11:47 p.m., and that someone wanted David to know that the official story was a lie. You okay? Karen's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, already dressed for work, concern creasing her forehead. You've been standing there for ages. Yeah, David lied, slipping the photo into his pocket. Just thinking about the storm, you know. The anniversary. She walked over and squeezed his shoulder. You should go to the memorial this year. It might help. After she left, David sat at the kitchen table and really looked at the photograph again. Every detail. In the background, he could make out part of the community center. The left side of the building was clearly damaged, but it was still standing. The roof sagging but intact. If the building was still there at 11:47 p.m., then when did it actually collapse? And more importantly, was Rachel still alive when this photo was taken? The questions burned in his mind like acid. For 11 years, he'd accepted what they told him. Believed that Rachel died quickly when the building came down. That she probably didn't suffer. That there was nothing anyone could have done. Those thoughts had been his only comfort during the darkest nights. Now someone was telling him that might not be true. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Detective Amy Rodriguez. They'd been friends once back in high school. She'd led the investigation after the hurricane. They'd drifted apart over the years, especially after David withdrew from everyone and everything connected to that night. His finger hovered over her name for a long moment. Calling her meant opening up a door he'd kept firmly closed for over a decade. It meant asking questions that might not have good answers. It meant possibly discovering that Rachel's death wasn't just a tragedy, but something worse. But he thought about his little sister. Thought about her laugh, the way she'd always fought for underdogs, her stubborn refusal to give up on people. Rachel had spent her whole life standing up for the truth even when it was hard. He owed her the same. David pressed the call button. It rang 4 times before Amy picked up. "Hello, Amy? It's David Chen. I need to talk to you about the storm." There was a long pause on the other end. "David, wow, it's been years. Are you okay?" "No," he said quietly, pulling the photograph out again. "No, I don't think I am. Something happened this morning. Something that doesn't make sense. Can we meet?" "Of course. What's going on?" David stared at the timestamp on the photo. "I think someone lied about what happened the night Rachel died. And I think you need to see this." Another pause, longer this time. When Amy spoke again, her voice had changed. Less friendly, more careful. The voice of a detective hearing something she didn't want to hear. "Where are you? I'll come over." After they hung up, David made a fresh pot of coffee and sat down to wait. Outside, the storm clouds continued to gather, but he barely noticed anymore. His mind was already back in that terrible night 11 years ago, sorting through memories and official reports, looking for the cracks in the story they'd all been told. Somewhere out there, someone knew the truth about what really happened. Someone had taken that photograph. Someone had decided after 11 long years that David deserved to know. And David was going to find out why. Whatever it took. Whatever it cost. For Rachel, he would finally learn the truth. Amy arrived 40 minutes later, looking exactly like David remembered, but somehow different too. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray she didn't bother to hide. The lines around her eyes spoke of too many long nights and difficult cases. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the photograph between them like evidence at a crime scene. Which David was starting to realize maybe it was. "I don't understand," Amy said for the 3rd time, her finger tracing the timestamp. "This doesn't make sense." "That's what I said." David poured them both coffee, his hands steadier now that someone else was seeing what he saw. "Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me what you see." Amy pulled out her phone and started scrolling through something. Her face got tighter with each swipe. According to the official report, the community center's west wall collapsed at 9:32 p.m. The entire structure was deemed unstable. Emergency crews couldn't get in until the next morning because of the conditions. But Rachel's car is right there, at almost midnight. And look at the building behind it. I see it. Amy's voice had gone flat, professional. The voice she probably used when things weren't adding up at a crime scene. The damage is there, but the structure is still standing. They sat in silence for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Outside, the storm clouds David had been watching earlier finally opened up, rain drumming against the windows. "Amy, was Rachel still alive at 11:47? The detective looked up at him and David saw something in her eyes he didn't like. Guilt. "I don't know." "You don't know or you don't want to tell me?" "David, I need to be honest with you. When I reviewed the old files last night after you called, I found some things that bothered me. Things I missed back then, or maybe things I didn't want to see." David's chest tightened. "What things?" Amy pulled out a worn folder from her bag. "I kept copies of everything from that case. It was my first major investigation. I was young, eager to close it up neat and clean. But there were always little things that nagged at me." She spread several papers across the table. Witness statements, emergency response logs, photos from the scene. "Look at the timestamps on these witness reports," Amy said, pointing to 3 different documents. "This woman says she saw people running from the community center at 10:15 p.m. This man says he heard screaming from that direction around 10:30. And this elderly couple reported seeing flashlights inside the building at 10:45. But the building collapsed at 9:32, David said slowly. "Exactly. At the time I wrote it off as confused memories. People were traumatized. The storm was chaotic. Times get mixed up in situations like that." Amy rubbed her face. "But what if I was wrong? What if those people were right? And the timeline we were given was wrong?" David felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. Why would anyone lie about when the building collapsed? That's what we need to find out. Amy pulled out another document. "There's more. See this note in my handwriting? Delayed structural failure. Follow up with engineering. I don't remember writing that. And I definitely don't remember following up on it." "What does that mean? Delayed structural failure?" "It means the building didn't collapse all at once. It means maybe it held up longer than anyone said it did. Amy met his eyes. It means maybe there was time to get people out. Maybe there was time to save Rachel. The words hit David like a punch. For 11 years, he'd told himself that Rachel's death was instant, that she didn't suffer, that no one could have saved her. If that wasn't true, I need some air, he said, standing up abruptly. Amy followed him to the back porch. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the backyard into a blur of gray. They stood under the overhang watching water pool in the grass. There's something else, Amy said quietly. I need to tell you about Robert Mitchell. Who's that? He was the emergency coordinator that night. The guy who made the evacuation calls, decided which buildings to clear first, all of that. He retired about 5 years ago. Lives up the coast now. Okay, so yesterday after your call I drove up to see him. Told him I was reviewing some old cases. When I mentioned the community center, David, you should have seen his face. He got pale, started sweating. His wife said he hasn't been doing well lately. Some memory problems, but I think it was more than that. What did he say? Amy hesitated. He got really agitated. Started muttering about how they told him to wait and something about a developer. Then his wife asked me to leave. But just before I went, he looked right at me and said, I'm sorry about those people. I'm sorry about the center. We should have gotten them out sooner. David's heart was pounding now. What developer? What was he talking about? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Amy pulled out her phone and showed him something on the screen. Before I came here, I did some digging at the county records office. Look what I found. It was a permit application. A request to build a luxury waterfront development. The address made David's blood run cold. That's where the community center was. That's where the community center is now, Amy corrected. Those fancy condos they built 3 years ago? The ones that sold for $2 million each? Same exact spot. When was this permit filed? 6 months before Hurricane Delilah hit. David stared at the document, his mind racing. You're saying someone wanted that land? Someone who couldn't get it while the community center was standing? I'm saying it's a hell of a coincidence. Amy's jaw was tight. The center had been there for 40 years. The city council kept voting down any attempts to buy it or relocate it. Too many low-income families depended on it. Then the hurricane comes, the building goes down, 17 people die, and suddenly that prime waterfront property is available. Who owns those condos now? Amy showed him another document. Company called Vance Properties. Owned by a developer named Richard Vance. He's been building all over the coast for the past 20 years. Very successful. Very well connected. Very good at getting what he wants. The pieces were starting to come together in David's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. You think he had something to do with Rachel's death? I think we need to be very careful here, Amy said. I'm talking about powerful people. People with expensive lawyers. People who don't like questions being asked about decade-old disasters. If we're going to do this, if we're going to really look into what happened that night, you need to understand the risks. I don't care about risks. That's my sister we're talking about. I know. But David, I could lose my job over this. The case was closed. My superiors aren't going to be happy about me digging it back up without new evidence. David pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it up between them. Rain continued to pour beyond the porch, drowning out almost everything else. We have new evidence. Someone sent me this photo for a reason. Someone out there knows the truth about what happened that night and they want it to come out. He looked at Amy. Really looked at her. Are you going to help me find out who? Are you going to help me get justice for Rachel? Amy was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. Yeah, I am. For Rachel, and for the truth. David felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 11 years, he had hope. Not the comfortable kind that lets you sleep at night. The dangerous kind that makes you willing to fight. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of old documents, phone calls, and dead ends. David had called in sick to work, something he never did. Karen was worried, but he couldn't explain it to her yet. Not until he knew for sure. Amy met him every evening at a small diner on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. They spread their findings across the booth like detectives in a crime movie, except this was real life and the stakes were so much higher. Look at this, Amy said, sliding a folder across the table. Building permits for the community center. 3 months before the hurricane, Vance Properties applied for permission to do a structural assessment on the property. David frowned. But they didn't own the building. Exactly. The application was denied. But guess what? Amy pulled out another document. I talked to the city planning office. Someone overrode that denial. The assessment was approved 2 weeks before the storm hit. Who approved it? That's the thing. The signature is illegible and the digital records from back then are conveniently corrupted. Amy took a sip of her coffee, which had to be cold by now. But I found something else. A purchase order from Vance Properties dated 2 days before Hurricane Delilah. Heavy construction equipment, drilling machinery, core sample tools. David felt his stomach drop. Core samples? You mean they were drilling into the foundation? That's what this equipment is used for. When you want to see how stable a building is, you drill into the foundation and take samples. Amy's voice was tight. David, if they were doing that kind of work right before the hurricane, they could have weakened the entire structure. The implications were staggering. David sat back, trying to process it. So Vance's people were drilling into the foundation of a building full of people, and then a hurricane hit. Maybe. We don't have proof they actually did the work. Just that they had the equipment and the permits. But if they did, and the building collapsed because of it, then 17 people died because of criminal negligence. Amy finished the thought he couldn't. Including Rachel. David's hands clenched into fists. For 11 years he'd blamed the storm, blamed fate, blamed God. He'd never imagined there might be someone actually responsible, someone who could have prevented it. We need to talk to Robert Mitchell again, he said, the emergency coordinator. He said something about being told to wait. Wait for what? By who? Amy shook her head. His wife won't let me near him. She says the stress isn't good for his condition. But I have another idea. She pulled out her phone and showed David a social media profile. A young man, maybe 30, with Robert Mitchell's same sharp nose and worried eyes. This is Ben Mitchell, Robert's son. He's a landscape architect, lives here in town. I'm thinking he might know something about what's been eating at his father all these years. You want to talk to him? We need to. But David, you should probably be the one to reach out. I'm a cop. People get nervous around cops. But you're just a brother looking for answers about his sister. That's harder to say no to. David looked at the profile picture. Ben Mitchell was smiling in it, standing next to a garden he'd apparently designed. He looked like a good person. The kind of person who might help if asked the right way. Okay, David said. I'll message him. That night, David sent a careful message explaining who he was and what he was trying to find out. He didn't mention conspiracy theories or negligence. Just said he was trying to understand what happened to Rachel, and that anything Ben could share about his father's memories of that night would mean the world to him. The response came faster than he expected. Can you meet tomorrow? There's something I need to show you. They met at a park near the waterfront, within sight of the luxury condos that now stood where the community center once was. Ben was already there when David arrived, sitting on a bench looking nervous. Thanks for meeting me, David said, sitting down beside him. Ben nodded but didn't speak right away. He was holding a phone, old and cracked, turning it over and over in his hands. My dad's not doing well, Ben finally said. Dementia. Some days he doesn't recognize me. Other days he's sharp as ever. But lately he keeps talking about the storm, about the community center, about how he should have done something different. What does he say? He gets confused about the details, but the feeling is always the same. Guilt. He keeps saying he made a choice that night and people died because of it. Ben looked at David, his eyes red. I've been trying to understand what he means. Last month I found this. He held up the old phone. It's his work phone from back then. The city issued them to emergency personnel. He kept it in a box in the garage. I charged it up and Ben unlocked it and handed it to David. Look at his messages from the night of the storm. David's hands trembled as he scrolled through. Most of the messages were routine emergency coordination. But then at 8:47 p.m. there was a text from an unknown number. The center can wait. Focus on the residential areas first. We'll handle that building. David looked up at Ben. Who sent this? I don't know. The number's disconnected now. I tried calling it. What does we'll handle that building mean? That's what I've been wondering. Ben took the phone back and scrolled to another message. Look at this one. My dad sent it at 9:15 p.m. The message read, Center should be evacuated now. Building showing stress. Need units there immediately. The response came at 9:22 p.m. Negative. Hold position. Development assessment team on site. Do not interfere. David felt cold all over. Development assessment team. During a hurricane? I showed this to my mom, Ben said quietly. She started crying. Told me to delete everything and never mention it again. Said if I pursued this, it would destroy what's left of my dad's reputation, that he was a good man who did his best in an impossible situation. But this shows he tried to get people out, David said. He wanted to evacuate the center. Someone told him not to. Someone with enough authority that he listened. Ben wiped his eyes. I've been carrying this around for weeks, not knowing what to do. Then I saw your message and I thought, maybe it's time someone knew the truth. Rachel was your sister. You deserve to know what really happened. David looked at the messages again, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the proof that someone had deliberately delayed the evacuation of the community center. Someone who wanted assessment work to continue even as the hurricane raged outside. Ben, I need to show this to Detective Rodriguez. This is evidence, I know. Ben's voice cracked. But please understand. My dad, whatever he did or didn't do that night, it's destroyed him. He's been living with this guilt for 11 years. If this comes out, people will think he's a monster. He's not the monster here, David said firmly. He tried to do the right thing. Someone else stopped him. That's who we need to find. Ben nodded slowly, then did something that surprised David. He pulled out a memory card from his pocket. I made copies of everything. The messages. The call logs. All of it. He pressed it into David's hand. Find out who did this. Find out who's really responsible. Maybe then my dad can finally have some peace. After Ben left, David sat on that bench for a long time, watching the sunset paint the luxury condos in shades of gold and red. Beautiful buildings built on top of tragedy. Built on top of lies. He called Amy. I've got it, he said. I've got proof that someone stopped the evacuation. We know why the timeline doesn't match up. We know why Rachel was still there at midnight. David, that's incredible. Where are you? Looking at the condos. Amy, we need to find out who sent those messages to Robert Mitchell. We need to connect them to Vance Properties. That's going to be hard. It's been 11 years. Phone records might not exist anymore. Then we find another way. David stood up, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. We're close, Amy. We're so close to the truth. We can't stop now. We won't, Amy promised. Meet me tomorrow. I have an idea about who might be able to help us. Someone who was on the city council back then. Someone who might know more than she's been saying. As David walked back to his car, he felt Rachel's presence stronger than he had in years. Like she was watching over him, pushing him forward. He'd spent 11 years trying to accept her death. Now he was going to make sure everyone knew it should never have happened. Linda Harper lived in a small house at the end of a quiet street. The kind of place where wind chimes sang on the porch and flower boxes brightened every window. She answered the door in a cardigan despite the warm afternoon, looking thinner and paler than the photos David had seen from her time on the city council. Mrs. Harper, Amy showed her badge. I'm Detective Rodriguez. We spoke on the phone. This is David Chen. We'd like to talk to you about the community center. Something flickered across Linda's face. Fear, maybe, or resignation. She looked at David for a long moment, then stepped aside. I've been wondering when someone would finally come asking, she said quietly. The living room was neat but worn, filled with the kind of furniture that had seen better days. Photos covered the walls. Grandchildren, David guessed. People worth living for. Linda sat in a chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap. I have cancer, she said without preamble. Stage 4. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, probably less. I'm sorry, David said, meaning it. Don't be. I've made my peace with dying. What I haven't made peace with is taking certain secrets to my grave. She looked at them both. You're here about the night of the storm. About what really happened at the community center. Amy leaned forward. What do you know, Mrs. Harper? Everything. Linda's voice was steady but tired. I was on the city council for 12 years. Vice chair for 5 of those. I voted on every proposal that came through, including the ones about that building. Richard Vance tried to buy the property, Amy said. Multiple times. 7 times to be exact. Linda smiled bitterly. He wanted that land so badly. Prime waterfront location. Worth millions if developed properly. But the community center served 300 low-income families. We couldn't just take that away from them. The council voted no every single time, so what changed? David asked. Linda was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the arm of her chair. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Vance changed his approach. He stopped asking to buy the building and started offering to assess it instead. Said he was concerned about structural integrity, especially with hurricane season coming. Wanted to do a free evaluation, show the city where improvements were needed. Let me guess, Amy said. The council said no to that too. Most of us did. But there were a few members who thought it sounded reasonable. A free assessment, they said. What's the harm? They voted to allow it. Linda closed her eyes. I should have fought harder. Should have seen what he was really doing. What was he really doing? David's heart was pounding. Sabotaging the building. Not obviously. Not all at once. Just enough that when the right conditions came along, she trailed off, opening her eyes to look directly at David. I'm sorry about your sister. I'm sorry about all of them. The room felt too small suddenly. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. You're saying Vance deliberately weakened the community center? Before the hurricane? His crew was there for 3 days before the storm hit. They said they were doing assessments, taking samples. The city inspector who was supposed to oversee the work called in sick all 3 days. Later, I found out Vance had paid him $5,000 to stay home. Amy pulled out her notepad, writing quickly. How do you know all this? Because after the storm, after all those people died, things started eating at me. I started asking questions, making calls. One of the construction workers who'd been there those 3 days came to my house one night. He was drunk and crying. Said he couldn't live with what they'd done. What did they do? David could barely get the words out. Linda's eyes were wet now. They drilled into the support columns, took out more concrete than they should have for samples, weakened the foundation. The worker said his boss told him it was fine, that the building was being torn down soon anyway. But it wasn't being torn down. It was full of people when that hurricane hit. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. This worker, Amy said carefully, is he willing to testify? He's dead. Car accident 2 years after the storm. Single vehicle crash on a straight road in good weather. Linda's voice was flat. Very convenient. David stood up, needing to move. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you tell anyone? I tried. Linda's voice cracked. I went to the mayor. He told me I was grief-stricken and looking for someone to blame. I went to the police chief. He said without hard evidence it was just conspiracy theory. I even tried to go to the media, but Vance's lawyers shut that down fast. Threatened defamation suits that would have bankrupted me. But you were on the council, David said, trying to keep the anger out of his voice and failing. You had power. You had a platform. I had cancer. Linda's face hardened. The first time, Beat It went into remission, but right after I started making noise about the community center, it came back. Aggressively, my doctors were baffled. I was too sick to fight Vance and fight cancer at the same time. So I chose to live. I chose my grandchildren over the truth. She reached into a folder on the side table and pulled out a thick envelope. But I kept everything. Every document I could get my hands on. Every conversation I recorded. Every piece of evidence I found. I told myself I'd come forward when the time was right. When I was stronger, she handed the envelope to David. I'm not getting stronger, and I'm tired of being a coward. David opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were permits. Bank statements, emails, photographs of the construction work being done on the community center. And there in the middle was a contract. What is this? He asked. Read the date, Linda said. David's blood ran cold. The contract was between Vance Properties and the city for the purchase of the community center property. It was dated 5 days before Hurricane Delilah hit. But the building was still standing, Amy said, confused. Exactly. Linda's smile was grim. Vance was so confident that building would come down in the storm, he had the paperwork ready to go. He knew what he'd done. He knew it wouldn't survive a hurricane. He just needed nature to do his dirty work for him. David felt sick. And when the building didn't collapse right away? That's where it gets worse. Linda pulled out another document. Phone records. The night of the storm, Vance made 17 calls to city officials, including one to Robert Mitchell at 8:43 p.m. Amy grabbed the paper, comparing it to the messages on Robert's old phone. The times matched up. Vance told him to delay the evacuation, David said, the pieces finally clicking into place. He knew his crew had weakened the building. He knew it was going to collapse. He just needed to make sure it happened during the storm so it would look like a natural disaster. And he needed to make sure people were inside when it happened. Linda added softly, because an empty building collapsing doesn't clear the way for development. But a tragedy? 17 deaths? After that, who would want to rebuild a community center on cursed ground? Who would fight to keep it? Everyone just wanted to move on, Amy whispered. Exactly. Vance swooped in 6 months later with a generous offer. The city was in ruins, needed money for rebuilding. The council was different by then. Newer members who didn't know the history. They sold him the land for half what it was worth, and he built his condos. Linda's hands were shaking now. Blood money. That's what those buildings are. Built on the graves of 17 people who didn't have to die. David couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. For 11 years he'd thought Rachel died in an accident. A terrible twist of fate. But she'd been murdered. Maybe not with a gun or a knife, but murdered all the same. Killed by greed and corruption and the kind of evil that wears a suit and smiles for cameras. Why now? Amy asked. Why give us this now? Because I'm dying anyway, and I want to do one good thing before I go. Because those families deserve justice. Because I'm tired of looking at those condos and knowing what they cost. Linda met David's eyes. And because a young man came to my house last week. Ben Mitchell. He told me about his father's guilt, about what he'd found on that old phone. He said someone named David was looking into his sister's death. He asked me if I knew anything that could help. You sent me the photograph, David realized. You were the anonymous tip, Linda nodded. I've had that photo for years. One of the construction workers took it and gave it to me before he died. I kept waiting for the right time to use it. When Ben told me about you, I knew. This was my last chance to make things right. Amy stood up, clutching the envelope.
Mrs. Harper, this is enough.
This is enough to reopen the investigation, to bring charges. We can finally get justice for those 17 people. Can you? Linda looked doubtful. Vance has lawyers, money, friends in high places. You're going to need more than old documents and the testimony of a dying woman. We have the phone records, David said. We have the permits. We have the timeline proving the evacuation was delayed. And now we have motive. Then you'd better move fast. Linda leaned back in her chair, looking exhausted, because Vance doesn't like people digging into his business, and he has a way of making problems disappear. The next 2 weeks felt like living in a thriller movie, except David couldn't turn it off or walk away. Amy took all the evidence to the district attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Cole who listened to everything with a face that gave nothing away. This is substantial, Patricia finally said, spreading the documents across her desk. But it's also 11 years old. Vance will have the best lawyers money can buy. We need to be absolutely certain before we move. 17 people died, David said, his voice tight. How much more certain do you need to be? I need enough to convict. Patricia met his eyes without flinching. Because if we go after him and lose, he walks free forever. Double jeopardy. We only get one shot at this. She assigned 2 more detectives to help Amy. They spent days tracking down everyone who'd worked for Vance Properties back then, looking for anyone willing to talk. Most had moved away or refused to comment. The ones who did talk said they didn't remember anything unusual about the community center job. But then they found someone who did. His name was Tony Reeves, and he'd been a junior engineer for Vance 11 years ago. Now he ran his own small construction company 3 states away. When Amy called him, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I've been waiting for this call for over a decade, he finally said. Tony flew in 2 days later and met them at the district attorney's office. He was a big man with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly when he signed the witness statement. I was young and stupid back then, he told them. Fresh out of college. Vance hired me for good money and I thought I was lucky. But that job at the community center, I knew something wasn't right from the first day. What did you see? Patricia asked, recording everything. They had me doing structural calculations. How much load the support columns could handle. How much concrete could be removed before the integrity was compromised. I thought it was for renovation planning. Tony rubbed his face. But then I saw the drill logs. They'd taken out way more material than my calculations said was safe. Way more than you'd ever need for assessment samples. Did you report this? I tried to talk to my supervisor. He told me to keep my mouth shut and do my job. Said the building was coming down anyway, so it didn't matter. I didn't understand what he meant until after the hurricane. Tony's voice cracked. When I saw the news about the collapse, about the people who died, I knew. I knew we'd killed them. Why didn't you come forward? David couldn't help asking. Tony looked at him with hollow eyes. Because I was a coward. Because Vance's lawyers contacted me a week after the storm. Reminded me that I'd signed the engineering reports. That if anyone looked into the collapse, my name was on the paperwork. They said I could either keep quiet and keep my license or talk and go to prison for criminal negligence. They threatened you. They destroyed me without laying a finger on me. I couldn't work in this state anymore. Couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I moved away, tried to start over. But you can't outrun something like that. He looked at Patricia. If testifying puts me at risk legally, I'll do it anyway. Those people deserve justice. I should have spoken up 11 years ago. Patricia considered this. With your testimony, we have enough. The phone records, the permits, Linda Harper's documentation, and now an engineer confirming the structural sabotage. I'm going to convene a grand jury. It took 3 weeks for the grand jury to review everything. 3 weeks of David barely sleeping, jumping every time his phone rang. Karen finally sat him down one night and asked what was really going on. He told her everything. She cried. Then she held him. Then she said, "Finish this." For Rachel. For all of them. The indictment came down on a Tuesday morning. Richard Vance was charged with 17 counts of criminally negligent, homicide, conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and fraud. The news spread through town like wildfire. Vance's lawyers immediately went on the offensive. They held press conferences calling it a witch hunt. They claimed the DA was looking for someone to blame for a natural disaster. They painted David as a grief-stricken man who'd invented a conspiracy theory because he couldn't accept his sister's death. But then something unexpected happened. Other people started coming forward. Families of the other victims who'd always felt something was wrong about the official story. Former city employees who'd been pressured to change reports. Even a reporter who'd been investigating Vance years ago but had been forced to drop the story by his editor. The case became national news. Linda Harper gave one interview from her hospital bed, her voice weak but clear, telling the world exactly what Vance had done. She died 3 days later, but not before seeing Vance arrested. The trial lasted 6 weeks. David sat in the courtroom every single day, watching as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out the evidence. The drilled support columns, the delayed evacuation, the phone calls, the contract signed before the storm. Tony Reeves's testimony about the structural sabotage. Vance's lawyers argued that the hurricane was an act of God, that the building was old and would have failed anyway, that their client was being scapegoated for a tragedy no one could have prevented. But the jury saw through it. They saw the timeline that proved the building was still standing hours after it supposedly collapsed. They saw the evidence of deliberate weakening. They heard Robert Mitchell's messages begging to evacuate the center, and the orders telling him to wait. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. David felt Rachel's presence in that moment stronger than he had since the day she died. Not the crushing weight of grief he'd carried for 11 years, but something lighter. Relief, maybe. Or closure. Or just the simple knowledge that the truth had finally won. Vance was sentenced to 18 years in prison. His company declared bankruptcy within a week. The luxury condos he'd built were seized as part of the restitution payments to the victims' families. The city council voted unanimously to tear them down and turn the land into a memorial park. On the 1-year anniversary of the verdict, David stood at the park's dedication ceremony. 17 trees had been planted, one for each victim. Rachel's tree was a cherry blossom, her favorite. Amy stood beside him, no longer a detective. She'd retired 6 months earlier, saying she'd done what she set out to do. Ben Mitchell was there too, with his father in a wheelchair. Robert didn't fully understand what was happening, but Ben had told David that his father slept better now. The guilt that had eaten at him for years had finally lifted. The mayor gave a speech about truth and justice and remembering, but David barely heard it. He was too busy reading the plaque at the base of Rachel's tree. Rachel Chen, 1990-2013. She stood up for others. We stand up for her memory. Karen took his hand. She'd be proud of you. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. For 11 years, he'd wondered if he could have saved Rachel. If he should have been there that night. If there was something, anything, he could have done differently. Now he knew the truth. He couldn't have saved her that night. But he'd done something maybe just as important. He'd made sure her death meant something. He'd made sure that no developer could ever do something like this again without facing justice. He'd made sure the 17 people who died weren't just forgotten statistics in a storm report. He'd given Rachel her voice back. That evening, David visited the park alone after everyone else had gone home. He sat under Rachel's tree and finally said the things he'd been holding inside for over a decade. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. But I got him, Rach. I got the guy who did this to you." His voice broke. "You can rest now. They all can. The truth is out there. People know what happened, and it's never going to happen again." The wind rustled through the cherry blossoms, and for just a moment David could have sworn he heard his sister's laugh. That bright, fearless laugh she'd had when she was fighting for something she believed in. He smiled through his tears. Justice had taken 11 years, but it had finally come. And sometimes that was enough. David walked home as the sun set over the bay. The storm clouds from all those years ago finally truly cleared away. The past couldn't be changed. Rachel wasn't coming back. But her memory would live on in this park, in this truth, in the changes that would come from her story being told. And in the end, that was the best tribute he could give her. The truth had finally emerged. And with it, a kind of peace David hadn't known was possible. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing, of understanding, of justice served. It was enough. It had to be enough, and somehow it was.